Now, from Thailand to Nepal and now to down under, we have a very special lady. She is of the R4D organization of Australia, so it's with my great pleasure to invite the last speaker of this plenary discussion, Ms. Tara Hill. Please give her a hand.
Thank you very much. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here today. I think when you go on a secondment with your work, it can cause some confusion about what organization and where you're from. So Results for Development is based in Washington, D.C., but I recently was fortunate enough to work for 6 months with DFAT, which is obviously down under. When I was talking to my team about giving this speech, one of my team members said, you know, it's great that you're speaking at the beginning of the conference because it means you'll really be able to start from the basics. People won't be tired of hearing them yet. And another team member turned to me and said, well, and you know, if anything goes wrong, no one's going to remember by the end of a 3-day conference anyways. So I've chosen to take on board the words of my first colleague, and that is to really start with the basics of why we're here. At the Center for Education Innovations, where I work, we analyze innovative programs related to a wide range of education challenges, but there's something that I find particularly compelling about the concept of innovation for out-of-school children, because as long as education systems have existed, children have been out of school. And such an entrenched problem is therefore one of the most fertile grounds for innovation that you can probably think of, even more so because the contexts that are excluding children from out of school are constantly changing. But my comments today aren't going to be about extolling the virtues of innovation at all costs. We know that innovation isn't a silver bullet. But the reality is that on the one hand, we have clearly fallen short of ensuring that all children receive access to the learning opportunities that they deserve. And that on the other hand, we know there are tens, if not hundreds of thousands of practitioners out there in the field doing the incredibly important work and difficult work of testing and adapting and hopefully one day scaling new approaches to reaching out-of-school children. And so it's this work and this type of innovation that I want to focus on today. My remarks are going to focus on 4 simple questions. Where do we stand on ensuring access to quality education for all, building on the remarks of my colleagues earlier? Why do we need innovation? What do these innovations even look like? And where do we go from here? And I'm going to focus particularly on the role of non-state actors, like NGOs and social enterprises, in complementing existing government efforts to reaching out-of-school children. I'm going to use what we've learned from the Center for Education Innovations to highlight some emerging trends and models that we're seeing in response to the need for addressing this out-of-school children issue. And I'll provide a few examples there. And at the end, I'll speak briefly to the collective responsibility that we all face. And when I say we, I mean me, I mean you, I mean all of us in this room, if we're really going to harness the potential of today's innovations. But before we get to all of that, let's start with where do we stand on universal access? And let's start with some good news. So as those who have come before me have said, the good news is we've clearly made some significant progress. And over the past 15 years, the global number of out-of-school children of primary and lower secondary school age has dropped by 40%. East Asia and the Pacific is a region that's done particularly well. So since 1999, its number of out-of-school children has dropped by around 42%. But the bad news is that as a global community, we have clearly fallen short of our goal and our promise to achieve universal education at the primary level for all by 2016. And that since 2007, if you look at the circled area on that graph, you'll see that we've virtually stagnated in our progress. So what does this mean in absolute terms? It means that in 2013, we still had 124 million children globally who were not in school. 59 million of those were at the primary school level, and 65 million of those were adolescents of lower secondary school age. And in Asia, if you take the region as a whole, we're seeing that 56 million children of primary and lower secondary school age are not in school. So these are still staggering numbers. And even for those who are in school, the overwhelming evidence is suggesting that they're not learning basic skills. So the question is, how do we reach these children? If we're going to succeed in reaching these children, we need to know who they are, we need to know where they are, and we need to know why they're out of school. And that sounds pretty simple, but historically, a lack of data on the nature of out-of-school children, as well as a tendency to group them all together into one category, has made this quite difficult. But this is changing now, and we know that out-of-school children are not a homogeneous group. We know they're out of school for a number of different reasons, and these relate primarily to geography and demography. Over half of the world's out-of-school children reside in conflict-affected countries, and this is continuing to rise. 31 of the 59 million primary school-age children who aren't in school are girls. Income level, ethnicity, linguistic group, these are all determinants of whether or not children are going to school, and these factors tend to compound each other. So in Vietnam, the data is telling us that a poor girl is 20 times more likely to be out of school than a rich boy. Huge difference. In East Asia and the Pacific, we see that more than half of the children who are out of school are actually primary school dropouts. And this is quite high compared to the global average, where only about 23% of out-of-school children are dropouts. And so what this is telling us is that in this region, retention seems to be a major issue. Children are having some exposure to school, but the question is, how do we keep them in school? Whereas if you look at the data for South and West Asia, almost half of the out-of-school children are unlikely to ever enter school. So that suggests a much greater access issue. And so essentially what this is showing us is, even when you look at Asia as an entire region, the differences among sub-regions are significant. And even if you were to break this out into different countries, you would see even more significant differences at that level as well. So we know that out-of-school children are very diverse. And let's now talk about why they're out of school and why we need innovation in order to reach them. And the reason I want to touch on this is because when we're talking about out-of-school children and innovations that are working to reach them, it's really important that we understand what are the problems that those innovations are trying to address. I've chosen to focus on 3 root causes of why children are out of school, globally and in Asia. And this is, of course, not a comprehensive list, but the 3 that I've decided to focus on today. The first is supply. Basic supply to schools and places of learning remains elusive and inflexible in many contexts, but particularly in rural, remote, and hard-to-reach areas. And we're not going to be able to ensure that children are learning until we can ensure that there's sufficient supply. The second is a lack of tailored education opportunities, which is preventing basic learning and the acquisition of relevant skills. So for all of the different subgroups that I just mentioned, they're going to require different learning solutions if we're really going to succeed in reaching them. We can't just use the same approach to reach all of them. And so this includes things like remedial education for dropouts, girl-friendly schools, providing mother tongue education, all of the different things that we heard about already even in the opening remarks this morning. The third root cause that I'm going to talk about is household economic barriers. And this can include direct barriers like school fees. It can include indirect barriers like the cost of uniforms, transportation, materials, even the opportunity costs of being in school. And again, if we're really going to ensure that all children are learning, we need to ensure that out-of-school children can actually afford to go to school or to access learning opportunities. So why should we care about innovations for out-of-school children? And why do we need them? Well, we're clearly still a long way from solving the issue. And existing approaches and policies have made a significant dent. There's really no question about that. We've seen some really successful programs such as cash transfer programs, equivalency programs that bridge formal and informal schooling, even the abolition of school fees in many contexts. But as I've just illustrated, out-of-school children are not a homogeneous group. They require different and tailored interventions and programs to really ensure that we're reaching them and that they're learning. They can't all be reached with that one same approach. And traditional public sector macro approaches haven't always fully reflected that level of diversity. Programs driven by non-state actors, arguably they have a bit more flexibility to test and iterate new approaches that the government can then roll out. They can provide additional targeted delivery in areas where the government may be struggling to reach out-of-school children. And this in no way suggests that the role of the public sector isn't important. We know that system-wide interventions and policies are very critical. But as you can see, the two can work hand in hand and can complement one another. And government support for these innovations is often crucial to helping them to scale and ultimately have as much impact as they can. What kinds of trends and models are we seeing then in response to the out-of-school children issue? So to answer that question, I dove into the Center for Education Innovations, or CEI, which is an initiative that's run by Results for Development. And CEI is a global network of innovative education programs. We have over 650 programs included in our global online database. And what we do is we work with these programs to provide them with resources, we link them with potential donors, and with a small number, we work really closely with them to embed learning processes, hopefully so that down the line, they can increase their impact. We also produce analysis on the extensive data that we've collected over the past 3 years around the types of innovative models that we're seeing emerge in response to a number of different education issues. So what I'm going to do now is just give you a snapshot of the types of themes and models that we're seeing that are responding to the 3 root causes that I just mentioned. The first root cause that I mentioned was insufficient and inflexible supply. We're seeing a number of different approaches to targeting and tackling this issue, and the first is really challenging that notion that schools need to be static or fixed in one place. Mobile education delivery for nomadic and hard-to-reach communities is on the rise. So in Bangladesh, this takes the form of floating schools on boats. Along the Thai-Burmese border, this includes schools that can be easily assembled and disassembled and relocated so that they can move with communities who lack land rights. We're seeing a huge increase in the number of technology-driven innovations, often that seek to target remote and hard-to-reach children. So this includes MOOCs that provide distance education. It includes apps that provide self-learning opportunities in areas where maybe there aren't as many teachers or schools. And finally, we're seeing several examples of networks of alternative basic education centers, and ranging from Kenya to Myanmar, that are serving the unique needs of refugee and displaced children who often are not being served by the formal system, and are helping them to, when the time is right, reintegrate that formal system. So I'd like you to take a moment now and just imagine that you are not in school and you're unable to participate in the traditional school system. And maybe this is because of ongoing conflict in your region. Maybe it's because of a nomadic lifestyle of your family. Or maybe it's just because there's been an underinvestment in alternative education in your country. This is the problem that Can't Wait to Learn is seeking to address in Sudan, and it's the one example that I've decided to pull from outside of the region. And it's the product of a partnership between UNICEF, War Child Holland, and the Sudanese Ministry of Education. And So imagine now that you suddenly have access to the official mathematics curriculum for out-of-school children. And you can access this through a tablet-based, interactive, and self-guided course that takes the form of a game on a tablet, like you can see there. And when you take this course, at the end of it, you receive credentials that allow you to integrate the formal school system. And you can use these tablets at any time of day from community spaces in your village in complete accordance with your home schedule. These are all core features of this program's approach. One of the really exciting things about this program that we've seen is the extensive research it's doing to ensure that its development is being based on rigorous evidence. So it's doing a number of different pilots, including pre-post assessments of learning outcomes, and all of those have shown positive results. And on top of that, what's really interesting is it's complementing that with a lot of psychosocial research. So it wants to make sure that this program and this app is having positive effects on children's levels of self-efficacy, motivation. And this is quite interesting, and they've decided to do this in light of some of the negative outcomes that we've seen associated with these outcomes in some previous technology-based interventions. A key challenge that this program is facing is actually linked to its ultimate scalability. So the program has been highly customized to be consistent with the local context, and it's key to what's made it really successful up until now. But at the same time, it's been designed with out-of-school children in mind more broadly, and it's hoping that, in a few years, it might be able to replicate or scale its model in other countries. And you can see how a model like this could be really relevant in a number of contexts, including in Asia. But the time and the resource implications of redesigning its program to that same level of customization every time it wants to enter a new country could be substantial. And so this is that key tension that the program is facing is how do you balance both the high levels of customization that are often driving your program's success with the ultimate long-term scalability of your model. And it's something that we've seen several particularly technology-driven innovations on CEI grapple with. Maybe one of the most diverse and exciting areas of innovation that we've seen is in response to the second root cause that I mentioned, the lack of tailored education opportunities. And I think this is where most of the conversations at this summit are likely to be focused. So here, we're seeing a major trend towards increased specialization. We see a number of non-formal second chance education programs that are specifically targeting the needs of out-of-school youth, providing them with life skills training, employability training. We are seeing accelerated learning programs that have been a hugely important innovation for dropouts and overage youth, allows them to quickly reintegrate back into the formal system. And we're seeing several innovations that are simply focusing on providing targeted and tailored pedagogies, materials, curricula, all for the different subgroups that I've already spoken about. So let's now take another example from the CEI database, and let's turn to Cambodia, where historically children born with vision or hearing disabilities have been excluded from the education system. And if you were one of these children, you probably wouldn't attend school because there were no materials available to you in Braille, and you had never been taught sign language, let alone had your teachers been trained in how to teach you in sign language. This has changed significantly as a result of an organization that's been based in Cambodia now for 25 years called Krusa Theme. And it's actually represented here at this conference over the next few days, which is very exciting. And it just celebrated its 25th anniversary last week. And it was the first organization that provided adapted materials in Braille, that developed Khmer Sign Language, and that trained teachers in how to use this. And so now, deaf and blind children in Cambodia, they can access education through one of the centers that this program runs across the country, which then help them to transition back into the public school system. And the government is already funding several parts of this program, and the plan is that by 2020, the Ministry of Education wants to incorporate the model into its formal system and into its formal curriculum. So this is a really fantastic example of what I was talking about earlier in terms of innovation that is happening initially maybe outside of the formal system, albeit in close partnership with it, but that is then being scaled through the formal government school system. What's really inspiring about this program and about several of the other programs that we work with on CEI is the sheer length of time that it's been around for. So I mentioned 25 years. And I think there's a temptation when we talk about innovation for out-of-school children or innovation in general to associate that with programs or new organizations and players that have just come around this year or this month. And many of those programs are doing really innovative work, and they deserve to be highlighted and supported, and we have many examples of those on CEI. But a lot of our successful programs are being driven by organizations that have been around for decades, like Crusatami, like BRAC, like Pratum, organizations for whom ongoing adaptation and innovation just simply forms part of their core DNA. And to get to the point where an organization like Crusatami is today on the verge of a government rollout can take years or decades of incremental work and progress. And I think that's something that's important to remember when we're talking about innovations in this context. Finally, we're seeing several innovations tackle the third root cause that I mentioned, which was household economic barriers, while also seeking to improve education outcomes at the same time. Output-based aid is one type of approach that's doing this, and in Vietnam, schools pre-financed tuition for disadvantaged youth at the secondary level, provided that certain learning outputs were then met. So it was essentially a form of results-based financing. CordAid is a Dutch NGO that's taking a very similar approach in the DRC and in Malawi, but it's taking this a step further in that it provides higher subsidies to schools for enrolling marginalized groups, so groups like girls, orphans, and vulnerable children. And in both of these cases, these programs are essentially reducing or completely eliminating the household costs of education for families. So as a final example now, let's turn to Indonesia, where according to the 2010 national census, about 3.5 million children were still not enrolled in primary or junior secondary school. And about 2.7 million children were involved in some form of child labor. YCAB is a social enterprise whose mission is to reach these youth who have dropped out of school, who are working in the streets, who have to support their families. And it does this by running 76 learning centers, or as they call them, Rumah Belajar, across the country, which focus on providing vocational skills, English and computer literacy courses, accelerated primary and secondary schooling. But what makes this model particularly interesting is at the same time, it provides microloans to mothers so that they can run their own businesses, provided that they ensure their children enroll in school. So this is essentially killing 3 birds with 1 stone. It's providing access to capital to mothers so that they can run family businesses. It's reducing the household economic costs of education. It's basically bringing down those opportunity costs of sending your child to school because you now have that additional loan. And it's creating a source of revenue for the program's core model, which is the learning centers. So all of the revenue that's generated from these microloans is then reinvested back into the Rumah Belajar. The key challenge that this program has faced is actually linked to measuring its long-term impact. So it's able to say how many youth have passed through its program. It knows how many of those, or what percentage of those, are still employed 1 year after the program. But it's been really difficult for the program to track that 5 years out or 10 years out. And this is something that we've seen several vocational and skills-based programs struggle with on CEI because In the context in which these programs are operating, youth move frequently, they often lack a permanent address. So this program is actually thinking about tracking them via Facebook now because everyone has a Facebook these days. But being able to track and do this type of longitudinal research is really important to being able to demonstrate the long-term impacts of programs like YCAB and like many others. So if we look across these innovations, and particularly the ones that have shown some initial success, what are some common factors that we're seeing? For one, they really emphasize local relevance. So we saw that in the example with We Can't Wait to Learn in Sudan. The game's visuals are highly customized to be consistent with children's local realities. They don't want children's cognitive load to be going towards figuring out unfamiliar games or settings. They want it to be going to the actual educational material and experience. Many have very active community or parent engagement strategies, and they really focus on bringing the education opportunities to the children who are out of school. They don't just expect these children to come to their program. And a really good example of a program that's doing this effectively is an NGO based in India, Educate Girls, which has a whole host of interventions focused on mobilizing community volunteers, making sure that these volunteers are actively seeking out girls who are out of school in their village, working closely with families to bring them into the formal school system. Second factor that we've seen is that they plan for sustainability and scalability from the outset. So we've seen several programs struggle to really grow when they start to think about scaling only at the point in time at which they decide that they want to scale and not beforehand. And planning for scalability and sustainability can include a number of different things. One of the things that it can include is obviously diversifying your sources of funding as a program. So YCAB in Indonesia is an example that has done this very well. It has a number of corporate partnerships on the one hand that provide a source of revenue, and then it also has its microloans program. But this can also include identifying opportunities for partnerships with government early on. So we saw in Cambodia that Krusatami has done this very effectively, and that's another way of approaching this issue. Many are led with, so finally, another third factor for success is that they recognize that to turn an innovation into a successful into a successful program and an operational program requires input from many. So most of them are working in some form of multi-stakeholder partnership, whether that's with government agencies, research institutes, community organizations. And we've noticed that a lot of them are led by very passionate and visionary leaders at the helm, and that makes it quite tricky to replicate because obviously that comes down to individuals, but that's certainly a trend that we've seen. And the final point is they know when to leverage technology, and they know when technology just isn't needed or isn't required. In the same way that we know innovation isn't a silver bullet, we know that technology isn't either. We've learnt that over the years. And a lot of our successful programs on CEI, they don't use technology that much, or they don't use it at all. They're very simple innovations. But a lot of them do use technology, and what we found is that the ones that do so successfully, it's because they use technology only as much as is needed to achieve the core goals of the program, but they don't allow the technology to become the main outcome. So where do we go from here? There are 3 ideas that I hope you'll take away based on what I've talked about today. The first is that non-state innovations can play an important role in complementing existing government efforts to reaching out-of-school children, and not only in reaching them, but in ensuring that they're actually learning. We talked about 3 root causes of why children are out of school today. So the second takeaway I want to leave you with is that the innovations we're seeing emerge are responding directly to these root causes, and they're doing so in a diverse and flexible way. And this is incredibly promising, that these innovations are addressing the real barriers in the field. And the third idea is that to take this movement forward is going to require input from everyone, not just the people who are doing the innovating. Because that's what it's going to take if we really want to see this constellation of non-state innovations that have emerged over the past decade, which is pretty well documented at this point, really turn into systematic and sustained change. So we don't just need flexible learning strategies, but we need flexible funding, we need flexible evaluation processes, we need flexible policy environments. So whether you're an implementer or whether you're a government or a researcher or a donor, there really is a role for all of us to play. And at CEI, our goal is we want to support and build an ecosystem of collaboration. And we want to see others in the field moving towards supporting and investing in this ecosystem as well, in addition to supporting promising and high-impact models as we've seen in the past. We see huge potential for increased collaboration, peer-to-peer learning, adaptation, and these are all things that we are actively facilitating through CEI. I think all of us know that this is an incredibly exciting time and an important time to be working in this area, or there wouldn't be 400 plus of us sitting in this room today. So as we head into the next 3 days of this conference, let's really commit to identifying some real opportunities for working together on these issues. Think about which of these 4 groups you fall into, of the ones that I just mentioned, and think about what type of collaboration are you looking for and what type of support can you provide, because based on what we've learned from CEI, I am sure that there are many others in this room who not only could help you and support you, but who, more importantly, could learn a lot from you. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to learning from all of you over the next 3 days.